AP Comparative, happy Monday, April 6th. Welcome back to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. I'm Mr. Andrew Canine from the suburbs of Chicago, here helping you try to master AP Comparative Government and Politics. So welcome back, and if you're a new viewer, welcome as well. I'm going to walk you through some tips if you're brand new. To how to start prepping for your AP comparative exam, particularly this revised exam in 2020 amid the COVID-19 turmoil. We're going to be talking a lot about COVID-19 today, particularly as it relates to today's topic, and that is federal versus unitary systems of government. So we are into Unit 1. I'm going to cue up our screen here. We're in Unit 1. And we're studying topic 1.7 today. We're looking at federal and unitary systems of government, particularly as they apply to our 6 different core countries. Again, I'm Andrew Canine. I teach at Adlai E. Stevenson High School in the suburbs of Chicago. And if you are new to us, I would invite you to get into your College Board resources, particularly the course description for AP Comparative Government. And there's a link you can go directly or indirectly and find the AP comparative course or any of your courses. But I really recommend this particular course description. It's a brand new course description for the 2019 and 2020 school year. It's organized thematically. And I know if you've listened before, you've heard me say that I know a lot of your teachers teach the course country by country. It's a perfectly fine way to get you to master comparative government. The College Board materials that I'm referencing are mapped out thematically in this course description, and they're done by these different topic coding. So if this coding is unfamiliar to you, make sure here's a link where you can go directly to the PDF of the course description. And you can also go to, Mr. Dan Larson has the website citizenu.org with a lot of AP US government prep materials. But go in the comparative corner and you can download a PDF of what we call our text messages that incorporate all of the course description, plus some of the supplemental notes you're going to see on these slides. So make sure you download those materials. Also take a look at the AP coronavirus updates.collegeboard.org page for students. If you have not seen the updates, College Board has announced the official test dates for this revised 2020 AP exam. They start on May 11th. AP Comparative is scheduled to go on May 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So if this is new information to you, you can get into that web page and look at the information for AP Comparative and any other AP exams that you're signed up for to get information on the times and also the content that's fair game. We're focusing on content from units 1, 2, and 3. And we always start off with our teacher shout outs. So please keep those shout outs coming to hashtag APCompGov2020. Your teachers have worked really hard to get you to this point. They've done a terrific job. I'm just helping them down the stretch to, in many cases, re-solidify content and skills that they've helped you with for most of this school year or most of this semester. So your shout outs of their hard work, their continued hard work is super appreciated. We have Ms. Hermes at Rogers High School out in Newport, Rhode Island, beautiful Newport, Rhode Island, and Mr. Torgeson. And Ms. Tiffany Wayne, a shout out from Ms. Wayne. And this teacher has received a number of different shout outs. Each time he gets a shout out, he has a different nickname. So we're going to call him Nick the Name Vose. Shout out to Mr. Vose and your very supportive students. So thank you, students, and thank you, teachers. Continue to shout out your teachers at hashtag APCompGov2020. Also, looking for any country examples you have. And you can put those on hashtag APCompGov2020. Very active hashtag with country examples from teachers, from students, and some interesting guests on the hashtag I'm going to talk about in a moment. One of the interesting news stories I found over the weekend actually comes from I'm going to switch my sources here, the TASS news service from Moscow. And let's see if we can bring that up here. This is news from Moscow from last Friday. And we're going to get rid of that. And it says Moscow launches monitoring system for COVID-19 patients. And then according to Moscow's IT department on Friday, first patients diagnosed with novel coronavirus were given smartphones with a pre-installed social monitoring app. Today, we are looking at federal versus unitary governments. We're looking at how our different core countries handle policy. Do they focus on the central government having a role in policy, or do they delegate powers to regional governments or municipal governments? In this case, you're going to learn that Russia is a federal government. It has a lot of different regional and local governments. Of course, one of the largest municipal governments in Russia is Moscow, the city government of Moscow. And so you have a story here about the use of a very interesting giving coronavirus patients, when they leave the hospital or after they're diagnosed, a pre-installed social monitoring app on cell phone devices. Just remember, whenever you're looking at any news source, it's important to have news literacy. And so if you look up if you're not familiar with TASS, this is a state-controlled, it's a government-owned news source. So anything on this news source essentially has been, you can think of it, pre-approved by Russia's government to put on here. So a very interesting case when we're talking about federal versus unitary and local responses. So I'm going to switch back here to the PowerPoint. Some breaking news from over the weekend included, and from today, the hospitalization of Boris Johnson from the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was hospitalized. We knew he was diagnosed or tested positive with coronavirus about 9 days ago. So there's, and Chris G put another story out on hashtag APCompGov2020 about Boris Johnson, and that was the increased funding for the National Health Service as a central response to COVID-19. So the National Health Service is the United Kingdom's central healthcare system run by the central government. And that was contrasting, according to Chris, with a more local response that the United Kingdom has, and that was Northern Ireland, or NI, their local government deciding to release prisoners who are at risk of coronavirus in one of their prisons and jails in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is one of the 4 nations or countries that make up the state of the United Kingdom. And so there was a local response there. Mr. Waxler at hashtag APCompGov2020 put out a terrific tweet about the Queen's response that she broadcast last night. The Queen is the head of state of the United Kingdom. And as the head of state, she put out a response and he was challenging students to find different themes and concepts that were part of her speech. So that's something you can interact with at hashtag CompGov2020. And Saturday night, Twitter got really interesting at hashtag CompGov2020 with some international activists reaching out to our hashtag to talk about federalism and the local government response to COVID-19. We had a gentleman, Bishop Adesanya, who tweeted at hashtag APCompGov2020. And he was specifically talking about an area outside of the city of Lagos. It's actually called Lagos State, which is separate from the city of Lagos. And in this local council development area, what they call the LCDAs, so that essentially that would be like a city or a neighborhood of a city, specifically to Eobo Ipaja. He, according to this picture, was claiming that only 2 sacks of food aid were delivered by the local government to this neighborhood as part of COVID-19 food aid response. And he used the hashtag APCompGov2020 to bring the community's attention to this. I did a little bit of research. And I found out that this particular LCDA, this neighborhood, is part of, or this city area, is part of the Alimosho local government area. LGA in Nigeria is their version of a county government, if you would think of a county, and that these are all parts of local government that is actually in Lagos State in Nigeria. And we're going to look at the different states. Nigeria has 36 different states, but within those states, there also are local government areas, and then below that, a more municipal government would be the LCDA. All became part of hashtag APCompGov 2020. I was really curious about this, so I started doing some research, and I did find, again, to look kind of, to dive a little deeper on this, I looked up the Aobo Apaja LCDA, and they actually have a Facebook group. And coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, there were a number of pictures of, it looks like, residents of this LCDA with what looks to be a local government official handing out much more than 2 sacks of food aid on their Facebook page. So got the tweet Saturday night, started exploring on Sunday morning. Really interesting case study within Nigeria of the federal response, and not just the federal response, but the local government response in Nigeria to COVID-19. So if you see other local responses contrasted with a national response to coronavirus, please use that hashtag, and we can all learn about this together. So today we are looking at topic 1.7. We're looking at federal versus unitary government. We are going to see this later in the next unit, 2.8, particularly when we look at how different countries organize their judicial systems. So we always try to connect these topics to other and spiral them into other topics. I am making my way through Unit 1. We're going to wrap up Unit 1, and then we'll move into Unit 2. We'll start looking at the institutions of government, and we will definitely focus on those first 3 units, but we'll also spend a little bit more time on Unit 4 and Unit 5, and particularly, I'd like to put a lot of sample questions that I write, a few multiple choice, and we look at a lot at writing skills, and I try to model those writing skills so that you can practice yourself and see how your writing would measure up to the rubrics. So today, 3 critical words that you have to know about topic 1.7, and that's the difference between a federal state and a unitary state. And we'll also look more closely at this word devolution, which is a word that we look at when we talk about the distribution of governmental powers, specifically to the United Kingdom. When we get federal states, and this, again, if you're new to the online YouTube reviews, I think it's particularly important to note that in some of these cases, I'm taking definitions and examples straight from the AP Comparative course description. So any definition that you see here with an asterisk means it's coming straight from that course description. So again, it can be a really valuable resource to see what are the key vocabulary words and the concepts that are fair game on a comparative exam, and also in many cases to see examples and definitions. So in this case, the course description tells us that federal states, examples are Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia of our 6 different countries, and that these are governments that divide power amongst different levels of government, and they give different levels of autonomy, particularly in areas of policy when it comes to social services, educational services. We know in some cases, healthcare can have slight variances in federal states when different areas have autonomy, including transportation. But we also know that in all 3 of those countries, even though they give a degree of autonomy to local governments, we know that in all 3 of those countries, it's actually the central government that is the strongest version of government within that country. So looking at more specifics, Nigeria and Mexico are rather similar in some ways of federalism, but we're going to also look at how they're different. So one of the ways that they're similar is that both the constitutions of Nigeria and Mexico kind of guarantee state governments and regional governments certain powers. And one of those certain powers that's guaranteed in both Nigeria and Mexico is that the states in both of those countries. So Mexico has 32 states, including Mexico City, and Nigeria has 36 states. That the states in both Mexico and Nigeria are allowed to generate revenue with local taxes or state taxes. So we also know that in Mexico, we have a very strong central government, particularly because of oil revenues. And that's also similar in Nigeria. Both of those countries have very prevalent reliance on oil. Mexico's become less dependent on oil, but it used to be that Mexico was much more heavily dependent on the oil revenues from its national state-controlled oil company called Pemex. And that because they had this history of relying on these oil revenues from this national oil company, that essentially you developed a very strong central government during the course of Mexican political history. There are, even though they have a strong central government, there are some policies that are varied in the different states. And one of the most interesting of those policies to study in Mexico is particular to abortion. Abortion for much of Mexico's political history was strictly prohibited throughout the entire country. But more recently, we have seen states, including the Mexico City government, their regional government of Mexico City, allow the legalization of abortion up to 12 weeks of a pregnancy. So no state, there's only 2 states that allow legalized abortion. And in both of those states, legalized abortion is only accessible up to 12 weeks of a pregnancy. So that is how you might see examples of policy diversity in Mexico. Nigeria, on the other hand, I was looking up abortion policy in Nigeria. Nigeria has essentially a national law that deals with abortion. So there's no variance. And Nigeria is one of the stricter countries prohibiting abortions, not allowing legal access to abortion. And that is essentially a national policy. They also had a strong central government in Nigeria, even though it's a federal government with 36 states, and there's some diversity amongst local policy. But because of the history of military rule before the 1999 Constitution, and because of the dependence on oil revenues from the central government, you have a very strong central government, and the state and the regional governments tend to be much weaker. We do see some diversity in terms of how you see the governance of Nigeria, particularly with the example of the use of Sharia law or Islamic legal code in northern Nigeria. So there are 9 states in northern Nigeria where you have a more significant Muslim population. And there are 9 states that their legal systems are entirely Sharia, basically. And there are 3 other states that have hybrid judicial systems that incorporate Sharia law. So you see that kind of diversity in terms of governance because Nigeria is a federal government specific to its judicial systems in the northern states of Nigeria. When we're talking about unitary states, we're talking about states that control or concentrate power at the national level. And when you have states with unitary systems, you tend to see more uniform policies between the different states. So for instance, healthcare in the United Kingdom is more uniform because it is done by the National Health Service. You do see some variance, particularly over the last 20, 30 years, as the United Kingdom has devolved powers to regional governments, specifically to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. You see some variance in healthcare policy, but for the most part, we're talking about the uniformity of policies from the National Health Service. China, Iran are also considered to be unitary states. And I'm going to speak more to them in a moment, but I really have to ask you to be cautious in understanding what a unitary state here is, because a really big misunderstanding by a lot of comparative students is that when they see the word unitary state, they assume that that means that this is a more authoritarian government. And we certainly see examples of more authoritarian governments being unitary, but just because you're a unitary country doesn't mean you're authoritarian. And the really good example of that is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has for centuries been a unitary state with a very strong central government. The United Kingdom does not have any 10th Amendment. It has no constitutional guarantee that Scotland's going to have a regional parliament. At any point, the central government of the United Kingdom could take those local powers back because there's no constitutional guarantee. Yes, over the last 30 years, the United Kingdom has allowed more policy variance with this devolution of policy to its regions. But make no mistake, United Kingdom is a unitary government, even though it's a more democratic government. So to assume that a government is authoritarian just because of it's unitary is not correct. And similarly, we'll talk about Russia is a more federal government, but it certainly tends to veer towards the more authoritarian side, even though it's federal. So I'll give some examples of that right here. So with Russia, the degree to which power is centralized or decentralized can vary in federal and unitary states. And in many cases, that variance can be based on different ethnic cleavages and also how that country is operating with supranational organizations. So this is where Russia is a really interesting case study, because yes, Russia is the Russian Federation, and it is a huge country, incredibly diverse, ethnically and religiously, incredibly diverse, and geographically. And so there are definitely regional governments and city governments in Russia's federation. But we know that a key critical point in President Putin's leadership happened in 2004 when there was a terrible terrorist attack, particularly in the Caucasus area of Russia, bordering Chechnya, if you've heard of Chechnya. And this is right around the time that Russia was using coercion or military force to keep Chechnya to be part of the country of Russia. So Chechnya, you had the separatist movements, particularly Islamists in Chechnya, were looking to create separation with the Chechen Republic. President Putin fought not one, but two wars in Chechnya, used tremendous violence to keep Chechnya to be part of Russia. You had this response of this terrorist attack on a school in Russia. And the result was that Putin and the central government used this terrorist attack to heighten national government powers as a response. And some of this is natural. We saw this after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. We saw the US national government consolidate power at, say, the TSA, right? Airport security in the United States used to be managed by municipal governments. But after 9/11, the national government created TSA. That's part of the Department of Homeland Security. But in Russia, we saw not only that nationalization of powers, we also saw major efforts by Putin and the central government to get rid of democratic aspects in the local governments of Russia. And particularly one of those was to get rid of direct elections of the heads of the different republics and the different governors. And the Federation Council, Russia's upper chamber, grew much more into the power of the central government being able to direct who was going to be appointed into those positions. So that is where you saw, even though Russia's called a federation, we saw this movement towards a more centralization, power towards the national government, where Putin and his allies in the national government could direct and control political appointments and policies from the central government. And it resulted in this growing authoritarianism that we've seen over the last 20 years in Russia. Okay. With China, China is obviously our most authoritarian government of the 6 countries we look at. It is unitary, and yet on paper, China has autonomous regions. They have regions, specifically Tibet and Xinjiang, with particularly religious minorities in Tibet, with Tibetan Buddhists and Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. And there are constitutional protections in China on paper that protect language rights and property rights and religious rights of ethnic minorities in those regions. But we also see notable uses of coercion in both of those regions for the Chinese national government to maintain sovereignty. We've spoken about this before, but particularly uses of force You've probably read stories about concentration camps and upwards of an estimated million Uyghurs who at any given time have been part of these re-education camps or concentration camps in Xinjiang, and part of the central government's efforts to reduce and address the separatist movements of that Uyghur communities in that northwest province of China. So that's where you see unitary government. On paper, it looks like these specific regions have special rights and special protections, and they're literally called autonomous zones. But in reality, that central government of China has a very heavy hand in use of coercion to bring those regions under the central government control. And it's very notable that some of the political leaders who rise to power in China are actually assigned to bringing control over these two specific areas as a way to kind of measure, for the Communist Party to measure how effective these leaders could be in these particular regions before they become more powerful in China's central government. If you have other country-specific examples of the difference between federal and unitary governance, please tweet those out to hashtag APCompGov2020. If you have current news stories, please include a link. And it will allow us who are curious about these differences between our course countries to see those differences. We are getting into the practice question time of our lesson. I have a few multiple choice questions. The first one asks about the pairing of descriptions between unitary and federal systems of government. So I'm going to let you read through the A, B, C, and D potential answers to see if you can figure out what the correct answer to this question would be. Which of the following is an accurate pairing of descriptions for unitary and federal systems of government? And hopefully you got C, that the difference between unitary and federal is that unitary has more uniform national policies and federal has local governments addressing social and educational policies. So let's get into some more country-specific examples, contrasting how powers are distributed in our case countries. We have United Kingdom on the left and Mexico on the right. So which of the following is an accurate pairing of countries with a description of the distribution of governmental powers in those countries? So I'll let you read through those. And hopefully you narrowed in on that Mexico is federal, the United Kingdom is unitary, but then once you narrow that down, hopefully you got C as the answer for that. That United Kingdom is unitary, but with some distribution of powers to local and regional governments, whereas Mexico is federal or is federalism with distributed powers to regional governments. Let's do the same thing and we'll try to contrast Russia with China. And again, hopefully you remember that Russia is federal, so we can nix any answers there that say unitary with Russia. And hopefully remember that China is unitary. So that's the process of elimination we can use, some word association and disassociation. And that gets us to the answer of Russia has federalism with distributed powers to local and regional governments, whereas China is unitary with symbolic distribution of powers to local and regional governments. One final multiple choice sample here, and that is just name the concept. Which of the following is a concept used to describe the distribution of powers from the central government to local and regional governments? Is it unitary? Is it devolution? Is it political efficacy or political legitimacy? And I really hope by the end of today's lesson, you now know that that definition of distributing powers from the central government to local and regional governments is an example of devolution. So moving into some writing, I'm going to replicate some parts of the quantitative analysis. I'm not going to do a full quantitative analysis for you, but I would like to focus on this particular question, it says to explain, these are the skills we're going to focus on today. We're going to explain how a pattern or a trend connects to a course country. We're going to try to draw a conclusion based on the data and course concepts. And we're going to explain how the data demonstrates a political system. We'll try to connect that to two different course countries. So I'm going to give you a infographic or a chart, a table of our 6 different core countries. Last week, I showed you some data from the Freedom House Index of how Freedom House, a non-government organization, what they use to categorize different countries. So that's where that data comes from, Freedom House and their index score. And it's also their categorization of whether a country is free or not free or somewhere in between. And then we're also looking at today's categorization. How do these different countries distribute power? Are they unitary or federal? So I'm going to come back to that data, that table a couple different times here as we look at what the question asks. The first part of the question is, using information from the table, identify a country from the table categorized as more democratic with a unitary system. Letter B, explain how this country's unitary system demonstrates democratic characteristics. And then letter C, based on the table, information from the table, draw a conclusion about the pattern of information about the distribution of governmental powers from the table as it relates to the Freedom House Score Index. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to answer these. So for instance, using information from the table, identify a country from the table categorized as more democratic with a unitary system. So here's where we're looking for a country that's more democratic with a unitary system. We don't have to look very far. It's right at the top, and it is the United Kingdom. But make sure you're complete when you write answers. So, and you're allowed to repeat vocabulary from the question to do that. So according to this table, the United Kingdom is a country that is categorized as more democratic, free, with a Freedom House Index score of 93. So you don't get credit on this unless you get the right answer, which is United Kingdom as the country that is democratic with a unitary government, but also that you have connected it back to the table, and that we have data from the table that it is more free with a Freedom House Index score of 93. All right. The second part of the question, explain how this country's unitary system demonstrates democratic characteristics. So here's where you have to have some country-specific knowledge about the United Kingdom. And here's where the table isn't necessarily going to help you out with this. This is something that you should know, though, based on today's lesson. The United Kingdom's unitary system demonstrates democratic characteristics because the central government devolves power to local and regional governments based on laws passed by a directly elected national legislature. People democratically elected members of the House of Commons that since the 1990s has passed laws devolving powers from the central government to the regions, even though the UK is a unitary system. So this explains the process that United Kingdom came into this system of devolution because it is a democratic government. People elected members, MPs to the House of Commons, and those MPs over the last 30 years have voted to devolve powers to the regional governments, even though the United Kingdom is unitary. For letter C, now we have to use data from the table, and this gets a little bit more complicated because we're asked to do several things here. One, we have to use information from the table. We're asked to draw a conclusion. We'll talk about what that means here. And we have to say about the pattern of information, distribution of governmental powers from the table as it relates to the Freedom House Index score. So we're going to draw a conclusion. And the conclusion we're going to draw is based on the information from the table, a conclusion that can be drawn about the pattern of information about the distribution of governmental powers from the table as it relates to the Freedom House Score Index is that more authoritarian, not free governments tend to have unitary systems of power distribution. Both Iran, index score of 18, and China, index score of 11, are categorized as not free and both have unitary systems that greatly restrict the distribution of central government powers to local and regional governments. So that was how we connect information from the table to the Freedom House score, specifically as it relates to two different countries. In order to do that, we need to make sure that we have two different countries in there, and we also connect it to the table. So the idea that both Iran and China are labeled as not free, they're more authoritarian, and we've used the data from the table to describe that. And then we've given a reason for that to make sure that that reason is part of how we draw a conclusion. So today we've looked at the topics of federal states and unitary states. We have noted that we have examples of federal states, including Nigeria, Mexico, and Russia. And we have examples of our unitary states from our three other countries in AP Comparative Government, and that is Iran, China, and the United Kingdom. We know that unitary states have much more stronger central governments. It doesn't necessarily mean that a unitary state is always authoritarian, as we've seen with the example of the United Kingdom. And even though federal states divide power amongst different levels of government, it doesn't always mean that they're democratic, particularly as we've seen with Russia, which can use more authoritarian techniques. You should also note that that term devolution comes up in this topic, particularly as it relates to the United Kingdom. You'll see that word devolution come up more when we look at political legitimacy, a topic that we're going to start looking at tomorrow with topics 1.8 and 1.9, when we look at how different systems of government empower their judicial systems. We'll look at federal versus unitary, and also the difference between federal versus unitary systems greatly impacts how citizens participate within their governments, either their central governments or their local governments. So we will come back and connect today's topics to other topics down the road. So please tweet more country-specific examples of federalism and unitary governance to #APCompGov2020. Tomorrow, we are looking at legitimacy. If that is a concept that you have not heard of, you really need to do yourself a favor, go research what is political legitimacy. It really is one of the biggest overarching concepts in AP comparative government. And if you do know political legitimacy, I'd invite you to go out and look for examples of how do countries build legitimacy and how do they sustain legitimacy in all 6 of our course countries. If you'd like to share examples of that, please use our #APCompGov2020. Again, if you know of anybody who is struggling to access these online lessons on YouTube, or if you know somebody who is really concerned about accessing technology before that May 22nd test date, please contact them, make sure that they know this website exists, cb.org tech, encourage them to reach out and help them get access to that technology in this very unique testing situation in the revised AP Comparative Exam 2020. Thank you for tuning in. Tomorrow we are looking at one of my favorite topics of all these topics, political legitimacy. It's so interesting. Please be well this afternoon, and thank you very much.